The 1969 Kenworth W 900A had been standing in a field behind Earl Combs's barn in Leslie County, Kentucky, since the third week of October in 1998. 23 years. The grass had come up through the frame rails in the first spring and kept coming, season after season, until the lower step irons disappeared into the root mat entirely. The hood, which had once been a deep burgundy red, the color Earl had chosen himself from the Kenworth paint chart in the spring of 1971 when he'd ordered the truck new, had faded through pink and into a chalky rust orange that had nothing to do with the original color anymore, and everything to do with the weather that had been working on it since the Clinton administration. The chrome on the stacks had gone first. Then the mirrors. The glass in the sleeper window on the passenger side had cracked in a winter freeze sometime around 2004 or 2005. And by 2010, the opening was just open, and the birds had found it, and the mice had found it, and the years had found it, and all of them had left something behind. But the frame rails were straight. Anyone who knew where to look could see that. The rails ran from the front axle to the rear tandem without a bow or a sag, true as the day they came out of the Kenworth plant in Seattle, and the cab, despite everything the Kentucky seasons had done to it, sat square on its mounts. The NT C290 under that hood, the Cummins N Series, the big cam, the engine that had powered more long-haul freight across more American highway miles than almost any engine ever built, was still in the truck. Earl had never pulled it. He'd never sold it for parts, never stripped the turbo for a rebuild project, never let a neighbor borrow the injectors. When Earl Combs parked that truck in October of 1998, the day after he got his diagnosis from the oncologist in Lexington, he parked it complete. He walked away from it complete. He never went back. Earl had driven that truck for 27 years. He'd bought it new in 1971, which was an act of considerable financial faith for a 24-year-old man from Leslie County who had nothing except a CDL, a willingness to drive nights, and a father who had co-signed the note at the bank in Hyden. He'd run coal, lumber, cattle feed, manufactured goods coming out of the river towns. He'd driven it to the Pacific coast twice, and to the Gulf Coast a dozen times, and to every state east of the Mississippi more times than he could count. And when the long-haul contracts dried up in the mid-'80s and the regional work got thin, he'd adapted and kept driving and kept the truck maintained. He had a notebook, 3 of them, actually, a green spiral-bound series that lived in the sleeper behind the driver's seat, in which he'd recorded every service interval, every injector replacement, every valve adjustment, every time he'd reset the fuel plate. The notebooks were still in the truck when Macy Hensley bought it in the spring of 2021 for $1,500 from Earl's estate. She found them in a Ziploc bag that Earl's daughter had put them in sometime in the years after Earl died, in 2003, and left in the sleeper because she didn't know what else to do with them. Now, I need to stop here and explain something, because without understanding who Earl Combs was and what he did to that engine before he parked it, the rest of this story doesn't carry its full weight. Earl Combs did not just park that truck. Before he drove it out behind the barn in October of 1998, he changed the oil in the filters, all of them. He drained the fuel system and fogged the cylinders with preservative oil through the injector bores. He greased every Zerk fitting on the chassis, every driveline U-joint, every fifth-wheel pivot. He pulled the air cleaner and sealed the intake with a rubber cap. He stuffed the exhaust stacks with rags and covered them with tin cans wired down against the wind. He did all of this in 2 days, working alone, because his wife had passed in 1994 and his daughter was in Lexington with her own family, and there was nobody in Leslie County who needed to know what he was doing or why. He was a man who had spent 27 years keeping a machine in the condition it deserved to be kept in, and he was not going to stop doing that on the last day. Earl Combs died in the spring of 2003. The truck stayed in the field. His daughter, who was practical and not sentimental about machinery, called a dealer twice over the years about selling it, but the numbers she was quoted were low enough that she decided to wait, and then she got busy with her life, and then she forgot about it. And then 23 years passed. Macy Hensley was 31 years old in the spring of 2021. She had graduated from the diesel technology program at Southeast Kentucky Community and Technical College in Pineville 6 years earlier, and she had been working the parts counter at a shop in Harlan for most of those 6 years, which is not where she had imagined herself when she graduated, but which had given her something that a better-paying job might not have. Access to every technical manual, every parts catalog, every service bulletin for every engine and drivetrain that had moved freight through the mountains of eastern Kentucky for the past 50 years. She had read them, not browsed them, read them. The NTC 290, the NTC 335, the big cam series, the small cam differences, the PT fuel system, the AFC housing, the torque specifications for every fastener in the rotating assembly. She knew this engine the way some people know Scripture, which is to say, she knew it well enough to argue with it and well enough to trust it. She had grown up watching her father drive. He wasn't a truck driver by trade. He ran a small excavating operation out of Harlan County, but he had a long-nosed Peterbilt that he used for hauling equipment, and Macy had ridden in it from the time she was old enough to see over the dash, and something about the cab-over-engine relationship, the way a big diesel breathed and responded and communicated through the seat and the wheel, had gotten into her in a way that never left. When she graduated from the diesel program, she had wanted to find a project, not a daily driver, a project, something that needed the kind of attention she knew how to give. She heard about Earl's truck through the parts counter. A man came in for brake components for a flatbed he was running and mentioned in passing that he'd heard the Combs estate was finally looking to move the old Kenworth that had been sitting out behind the barn on Leatherwood Road since the 90s. Macy asked him to say that again. He did. She drove out to Leslie County that same weekend. She stood in that field for a long time before she touched anything. The grass was up past her knees around the front axle. The hood was the color of old brick. The chrome stacks were white with oxidation. A wren had built a nest in the gap between the cab and the sleeper fairing, and the nest was old and empty and falling apart, and Macy left it where it was and walked around the truck twice without touching it, looking at the frame rails, looking at the cab mounts, looking at the way the suspension sat. Then she put her hand flat on the driver's door and stood there. She paid $1,500 for it. Earl's daughter took the check without much negotiation, and Macy thought later that the daughter seemed relieved, not about the money, but about the idea of the truck going somewhere that wasn't that field. Now, here's what I need you to understand before I tell you about the 3 years that followed, because this is the part that changes how you hear everything else. Macy Hensley did not restore that truck. Restoration implies returning something to a condition it once had, which often means replacing what is worn with what is new, refinishing what is rough, making something look the way it looked before time worked on it. Macy did not do that. What Macy did was more specific and more difficult. She rebuilt what needed rebuilding, replaced what had failed, preserved what had held, and left the rest exactly as it was. The paint stayed the way the years had made it. The chrome stayed oxidized. The rust on the hood stayed on the hood. What changed was everything underneath. Everything that determined whether the truck would run, and how it would run, and what it would do when it was asked to do something. She pulled the NTC 290 in the fall of 2021 and spent the first winter on it in her garage in Harlan. The garage was a 2-car attached to the house she rented, and it was not large enough for this project to be comfortable, but it was large enough for the project to happen, and that was enough. She had Earl's notebooks, she had the factory service manual, she had the parts catalogs, she had 6 years of parts counter knowledge, and the phone numbers of 3 retired Cummins mechanics she'd cultivated over those years by asking good questions and listening carefully to the answers. She worked weekends and sometimes evenings after her shift, and she worked alone, and the work took the time it took. The rotating assembly was in better condition than she had any right to expect. Earl's preservation work had done what it was supposed to do. The cylinder bores had surface rust that came off with careful honing. The crank journals were within spec. The cam followers showed wear, but not failure. She replaced the pistons, the rings, the main and rod bearings, the valve train components. She rebuilt the PT fuel pump, the Cummins pressure time injection system, which is not a system that rewards impatience or guesswork, but which rewards someone who has read the service manual carefully enough to understand why each adjustment exists and what it is trying to accomplish. She set the fuel rate and the AFC response by the book and then refined it through running time, listening to the engine the way Earl had listened to it for 27 years, adjusting by ear and by feel and by the smoke color at the stacks. I need to stop here and explain the PT system, because this is the intellectual key to everything that happened at Harlan County. The Cummins PT fuel system, pressure time injection, operates on a principle that is almost the opposite of what modern high-pressure common rail systems do. Instead of injecting fuel at extremely high pressure for a very brief duration, the PT system injects fuel at moderate pressure for a duration determined by how long the injector is held open by the cam. The volume of fuel delivered per injection event is therefore a function of time, of how long the injector is open, and the pressure in the fuel rail, which is set by the PT pump. What this means in practice is that the fuel delivery curve of a properly tuned NTC 290 is broad and flat across a wide RPM range. Peak torque, which on a stock NTC 290 is 800 pound-feet, arrives at 1,200 revolutions per minute and stays available across a band that runs from roughly 1,000 to 1,600 revolutions per minute before it begins to taper. The engine does not need to be revved to make its power. It makes its power at the bottom, where the load is, where the ground is, where the chain goes tight. Think about what that means for a pulling event. A progressive weight transfer sled, which is what they run at Harlan County, gets heavier as it moves down the track. The resistance increases continuously from the moment the chain goes tight until the truck can no longer move the sled forward. The question the sled is asking the engine is not how much power can you make at peak RPM. The question is how much torque can you sustain at low RPM under increase in load. And the NTC 290, in a truck that weighs what this truck weighs, with the drivetrain gearing that Macy had selected for exactly this purpose, was built to answer that question in a way that modern engines, tuned for fuel economy and emissions compliance and peak horsepower numbers that look good in brochures, are not always built to answer. Macy had also gone through the drivetrain with the same methodical attention she'd given the engine. The Spicer 13-speed transmission had been rebuilt. The drive lines had been rebalanced. The rear axles, a pair of Eaton 44,000-pound rears, had been gone through completely. The ring and pinion sets inspected and found to be within specification. The differential internals cleaned and reassembled. She had selected a final drive ratio that put the engine's peak torque band directly in the range where the truck would be operating under maximum sled load. This was not an accident. She had done the math on a piece of notebook paper and done it again, and then called one of the retired Cummins mechanics and talked through the numbers, and when he said, after a pause, that she had it right, she wrote the final ratio down in her own notebook and closed it. The truck was ready to pull in the summer of 2023. 2 years of weekends and evenings in a 2-car garage in Harlan County, Kentucky. Total cost of the build, including the purchase price, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $11,000. She had receipts for everything. The Harlan County Diesel Pull is held every August at the county fairgrounds on the south end of town, and it draws a crowd that fills the grandstands and lines the fence rails and spills back into the midway behind the beer tent. And in August of 2023, there were somewhere between 1,400 and 1,600 people there on a Saturday afternoon when the temperature was 91 degrees, and the sky was the flat white of a day that had given up on being blue. The clay on the pull track had been watered that morning and had dried to a surface that was firm on top and soft underneath, which is the condition that rewards a tire that can find the ground without spinning, which rewards a truck that can apply its torque without drama. The Kenworth dealer operation out of Corbin had a presence at the event that year. They had a display truck, a 2023 T680 in full dealer livery, spotless, with a promotional banner across the back of the cab, and they had sent a regional representative named Todd Garrett, who was 41 years old and had been in dealer sales and regional development for 11 years, and who wore a Kenworth-branded polo shirt and carried a tablet and knew the current model lineup in considerable detail, and knew the history of the brand and the way that someone knows the history of a brand they represent, rather than the history of a machine they have worked on. Todd Garrett was walking the staging area when Macy's trailer came in. The trailer was a flatbed she'd borrowed from her father's excavating operation, and it was not a pull-in trailer, it was a work trailer, and the truck on it was the color of old brick and oxidized chrome, and 23 years of Kentucky weather, and the stacks were not polished and the cab was not waxed, and there was grass stain on the lower frame rails from the field it had come out of. Todd Garrett looked at the trailer as it came past him, and he said something to the man standing next to him, and the man laughed. And Todd Garrett smiled in the way that people smile when they are certain they are right about something. In the fourth row of the grandstand, a man named Raymond Sizemore had been sitting since 11 o'clock that morning with a thermos of coffee and a folding chair he'd brought from his truck. Raymond Sizemore was 67 years old and had retired 4 years earlier after 31 years as a factory-certified Kenworth technician, the last 18 of which he had spent as a senior tech at the dealer in London, Kentucky, where he had worked on every model Kenworth had produced from the mid-'80s forward and a fair number of the older ones that came in for service when their owners couldn't find anyone else who remembered how to work on them. Raymond had driven 45 minutes to Harlan County that morning because a man at his church had mentioned the pull event, and Raymond had not had anywhere particular to be. When Macy's trailer came through the gate, Raymond Sizemore sat forward in his folding chair. He looked at the truck for a long moment. He could see, from where he was sitting, the sleeper configuration. The factory Kenworth mid-roof sleeper that had been standard on the W900A in 1969, a configuration that had been replaced in the early 70s and was specific enough to the model year that someone who had worked on these trucks could date it from across a fairground. He could also see the exhaust stacks, which were the original diameter and placement, and the hood, which was the long butterfly hood of the W900A, and the overall proportions of the cab, which were the proportions of a truck that had been built before the aerodynamic era changed what a Kenworth looked like. Raymond set his thermos on the bleacher beside him and watched the trailer come to a stop. Macy backed the truck off the trailer herself, which took about 4 minutes, and she did it without a spotter, and she did it without drama. She set the brakes, climbed down, walked around the truck once, checked the tires with her hand, and went to the staging line to register. Todd Garrett was near the registration table. He introduced himself as the regional Kenworth representative, which he was, and he said something about the truck that was meant to be helpful and was not, and Macy looked at him with the expression of someone who has heard that kind of helpful before and said, "She runs," and wrote her name on the registration form. The class Macy had entered was the vintage diesel class, which at Harlan County that year included 7 trucks, the newest of which was a 1985 Peterbilt 359 that had been built for pulling and had been pulling for 15 years and was well regarded in the regional circuit. The oldest was Macy's truck. The other 5 were production-era trucks from the 70s and early 80s with varying degrees of modification, and 2 of them had been pulling competitively for several seasons and were known quantities. The Peterbilt went third. It was a good pull. The driver was experienced. The truck was tuned for this kind of work, and it moved the sled to 287 feet before the resistance overcame it and the wheels began to spin and the sled stopped. 287 feet. The crowd gave it a strong response. Todd Garrett, who was standing near the fence rail, nodded and made a note on his tablet. Macy was 6th in the running order. She had been standing near her truck for most of the afternoon, not doing much of anything visible, checking things that probably didn't need checking, drinking water from a bottle she'd brought in a small cooler. One of the younger kids who had been working his way down the staging area asking questions about the trucks stopped in front of the Kenworth and looked at it for a while and then looked at Macy and said, "Is this one gonna go far?" Macy looked at the truck and then at the kid and said, "I think so." The kid nodded and moved on. When the 5th truck finished its pull, Macy walked back to the Kenworth and climbed up and started the engine. "Now, here's what I want you to understand about the sound a Cummins NTC 290 makes when it starts cold in the summer heat after a proper rebuild and 3 years of careful attention. It does not sound like a modern engine. It does not start quickly and settle into the smooth, quiet idle that modern engine management systems produce. It catches, there is a moment of compression and fuel finding each other, and then it fires in a sequence that you can hear individually, each cylinder coming in. And then they are all running and the engine settles into an idle that is lower and more deliberate than what you hear from a modern truck, a sound that has texture to it, that has weight. The exhaust note through those stacks carries across a fairground in a way that a modern emissions-compliant engine does not carry. People turned. Not everyone, but enough. The sound had a quality that belonged to a different era, and the people who recognized it immediately. Raymond Sizemore, in the 4th row, put both hands on his knees and leaned forward. Macy pulled to the line. The hookup crew ran the chain from the sled to the truck's drawbar, and the chain lay slack on the clay for a moment, and then Macy eased the truck forward until the chain came tight, and there was the sound that everyone who has ever watched a pull knows, the sharp metallic note of a chain going from slack to loaded, a sound like a tuning fork struck against something real. And the crowd went quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when something is about to happen that they are not sure about. She did not spin the tires. She did not make noise beyond the engine note climbing through its range. The truck moved from the line the way a draft horse moves when it leans into a collar, without announcement, without drama, finding the ground and keeping it, the tires pressing into the clay and leaving clean tracks behind them, not rooster-tailed divots, but pressed tracks, the tracks of something that was applying force rather than seeking traction. At 50 feet, the engine note had settled into a register that was lower than you'd expect from a truck under load, because the load was not asking the engine to rev, it was asking the engine to pull, and the engine was pulling, and it was doing it at 1,200 revolutions per minute, where the torque was, where it had always been, where Earl Combs had understood it to be when he'd driven this truck for 27 years across the roads of this country. At 100 feet, the crowd had stopped talking. At 150 feet, the sled resistance had increased to the point where you could see the truck's frame working, a slight, controlled flex that is normal and expected, and is the frame doing its job. And the exhaust had darkened from clean to a medium gray that told you the engine was working at the upper edge of its fuel delivery. The turbocharger spooling in the way the NTC 290's turbo spools, not abruptly but progressively, adding air as the load demanded air, the whole system operating the way it was designed to operate by engineers who had understood what a truck engine was actually for. At 200 feet, a woman in the grandstand said something to the man next to her. Nobody heard what she said. The engine note had taken over. At 250 feet, the crowd began to make noise, not the noise of celebration yet, the noise of recognition, of people who had come to watch trucks pull and were now watching something they had not expected to watch, which was an unpainted 1969 Kenworth moving a progressive weight transfer sled past the distance that the best pull of the day had managed, past 287 feet, the clay curling up in front of the sled skids like furrows behind a plow, the chain tight and vibrating in a way you could see from the fence rail. She passed 287 feet at a walking pace. The engine note did not change. The RPM did not climb. The truck did not lurch or spin or make any of the sounds of a machine at the edge of its capability. It made the sounds of a machine operating within its capability, which is a different sound entirely, and the difference was not lost on the people watching. At 310 feet, the sled resistance finally overcame what the truck could sustain at that load, and the tires began to lose their purchase in the clay, and the truck stopped. 310 feet. 23 feet past the best pull of the day, in a class that included trucks built specifically for this purpose, driven by people who had been doing this for years. The crowd in those grandstands, 1,400, 1,600 people, in the flat, white heat of an August afternoon in Harlan County, Kentucky, made a sound that started in the front rows and moved backward through the bleachers like a wave moving through still water. It was not a polite sound. It was not the sound of people being impressed in a measured way. It was the sound of people who had seen something they would not forget, and they knew they would not forget it. And the sound they made was the sound of that knowledge arriving all at once. Macy shut the engine down. She climbed out of the cab and walked to the back of the truck and stood there with her hand on the frame rail, not performing anything, just standing. The chain crew was unhooking the sled. The announcer was saying the distance. She did not look at the grandstands. Todd Garrett had stopped making notes on his tablet. He was standing at the fence rail with the tablet at his side, and he was looking at the truck with the expression of a man who is revising something he had been certain about. He stood there for a moment, and then he walked over to where Macy was standing, and he said, "What year is that NTC?" And she said, "69 build, but the engine's been rebuilt." And he nodded and looked at the truck again and said, "What did you do to the fuel pump?" And she told him briefly, and he listened without interrupting, which was more than he had managed before the pull. Then he said, "That was a hell of a pull," and she said, "Thank you." And that was the end of the conversation. Raymond Sizemore came down from the grandstand after the awards. He had his thermos in one hand and his folding chair under his arm, and he walked to where the Kenworth was parked and stood in front of it for a moment. And then he walked around to the driver's side where Macy was loading her cooler back into the cab. He said, "I worked on these for 30 years. I haven't seen a W900A in this condition in a long time." Macy looked at him. He said, "The Sleeper's original." It wasn't a question. She said, "Everything above the frame rails is original." He nodded slowly. He put his hand on the fender, flat, the way you touch something you know, and stood there for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Earl would have liked to see this." Macy looked at him. He said, "I knew him, not well, but I knew who he was. Everybody in the trade knew that truck." He picked up his folding chair. "You did right by it," he said, and walked back toward the parking area. Macy stood next to the truck for a while after he left. The fairground was emptying out around her, the crowd dispersing into the parking lots, the pull track being cleaned up, the vendors beginning to break down their setups. The Kenworth sat on the clay with the afternoon light coming down on the oxidized hood and the white stacks and the grass stain on the lower frame rails, and it looked exactly the way it had looked when she'd driven it off the trailer that morning, because she had not changed anything about it, and she did not intend to. She had thought, once or twice over the 3 years of the rebuild, about painting it. The burgundy red that Earl had chosen from the Kenworth paint chart in 1971 was documented in the first of the green spiral notebooks. Earl had written the paint code down, as he had written everything down, and she could have matched it. She had thought about it and decided against it, and the reason she had decided against it was not laziness or economics. The reason was that the truck had earned its color. The years were in the paint. Earl was in the paint. The field in Leslie County was in the paint, and the frost that had worked on it through 23 winters, and the sun that had faded it through 23 summers. You did not paint over that. You did not make it look like something it had not been. She drove the truck back onto the borrowed flatbed trailer as the sun was getting low, and the temperature was finally dropping toward something bearable, and she strapped it down and drove back toward Harlan with the windows down in her pickup, and she did not feel the need to call anyone or tell anyone what had happened, because the people who needed to know would hear about it, and the people who had been there had seen it, and the ground had its record in the clay, and the clay doesn't care what something cost or how long it sat in a field or what a dealer representative said when it came off the trailer. The ground just tells you what a thing is. The Kenworth is in Macy's garage in Harlan County right now. She's driven it twice since the pull, once to the shop to have the front axle alignment checked, once because she wanted to hear it run on a long stretch of road. Both times she brought it back and parked it and covered it with the same canvas tarp she'd been using since 2021. And both times she checked the oil before she covered it, because that is what you do with a machine you are responsible for. Earl Combs's green spiral notebooks are on the workbench in her garage, in the Ziploc bag his daughter put them in. She has read all 3 of them. She has added a 4th. If you know a story like this one, a machine that waited, a person who heard what it was asking, a pull that settled something that needed settling, drop it in the comments. I read every one of them, and I mean that. The stories that don't get told in the big publications, the ones that live in county fairgrounds and borrowed trailers and 2-car garages in eastern Kentucky, those are the ones this channel exists for. If you've been watching for a while and you haven't subscribed, there is another story like this one every week, and it will find you if you let it. And if this one hit you the way it hit the people standing at that fence rail in Harlan County on a Saturday afternoon in August, pass it on. Stories like Earl Combs's truck don't survive unless somebody carries them forward. Macy understood that. Now you do too.